The story of the samurai does not begin with steel. It begins with mist, with salt wind on a restless sea, with gods pulling land from the waves like wet clay. In Japan's oldest chronicles, a divine pair, Izanagi and Izanami, stood upon the floating bridge of heaven and stirred the ocean with a jeweled spear. Drops fell and congealed into islands. From this sacred geography would rise courts, clans, and, after centuries of fragile peace, men and women who lived by the bow, the blade, and a code that had not yet learned to call itself a code. Let that sea breath carry you towards the shore of early Japan, where stone tools gave way to clay and cord and fire. The Jomon people lived by hunting and gathering, their pottery pressed with rope patterns and the memory of hearth smoke. The forests were generous, the coastlines rich. For thousands of years, life moved in circles, fish runs, chestnut harvests, festivals to appease sky and mounting. Then across the water came the rough tremor of change. From the continent arrived rice, bronze, iron, and new ways of organizing human life. Fields replaced glades, villages gathered into chiefdoms. This was the Yayoi Revolution, the slow thud of the water pail lifting, the rhythmic chop of new blades clearing paddies, the shine of metal at sunrise. Rice changed everything. Rice called for straight lines, levees, channels, schedules kept by water and sun. It bound people into labor and roles, and it needed defenders. The earliest fortifications appeared on raised ground. Watchtowers scanned horizons that now mattered in a new way. Iron edge met wooden shaft. Bronze bell chimed in forest shrines. Somewhere in this distant music, the possibility of a warrior class was conceived, still an unborn thought curled in the future, but moving. As the centuries turned, a power coalesced among kin groups, Uji, whose chieftains claimed descent from the gods. One group rose above the others, stitching confederation into something like a state. The Yamato polity learned to write the names of its triumphs using borrowed Chinese characters and court etiquette. It sent envoys to the Middle Kingdom, received books and Buddhist sutras, and imported systems for ranking officials, collecting taxes, and recording land. The court located at Osaka, then Nara, then the shining capital, at Heian, Kyoto, cultivated poetry and politics in equal measure. If you look closely, you can still see the lacquered corridors, hear sleeves brushing screens, and smell the incense offered to new deities who traveled from distant monasteries on silk roads of the mind. Heian Japan is remembered for gentle things, waka poems, moon viewing parties, romances threaded with longing, yet beneath that perfumed layer the ground buckled. Administration required land, and land is never still. As nobles, temples, and shrines accumulated, private estates, shoen, those parcels slid out of centralized taxation. Local managers, stewards called jito, arose to squeeze harvests and keep order. Armed retainers guarded granaries, escorted caravans, and settled disputes with swift arrows. Where court letters moved too slowly, the emperor reigned, the Fujiwara regents guided, but far from the capital, the blade increasingly set the terms. Take a breath here. Imagine a hilltop shrine wrapped with cedar and cypress. At its foot, a horse stamps in dewy grass, and a man in lamella armor fingers the grip of his bow. He looks toward a line of paddies that gleam like broken mirrors. His lord's crest is tied at his back. His face is composed but alert. He is not yet called samurai. Not exactly. He is a bushi, a warrior. And the bow is his soul. The bow first, the sword later. The way of horse and bow, Kyuba no Michi, was the original language of his craft. Clans grew around such men hardened by border skirmishes and local disputes. Among them, two lineages emerged as opposite poles of ambition: Minamoto and Taira. Both traced their ancestry to imperial branches cut from the main trunk and grafted into provinces. Both learned to farm loyalty in places where roads rutted and governors were intermittent visitors. Both understood that a letter sealed in Heian was a prayer, but a rider with retainers was an answer. In the 11th century's back half, wars flared like brushfire in tall grass. The earlier 9 Years' War, the later 3 Years' War, regional conflicts in the north, where court authority dissolved in snow and mud. In the fighting, techniques sharpened, mounted archers traded volleys at distance, then closed for spear work. The tales tell of single combat names shouted, genealogies recited, arrows loosed, a last quick strike that decided honor in the space between heartbeats. But most battles were uglier, messier: night raids, ambushes at fords, storehouses burned, hostages taken and returned for the price of a season's grain. Victory depended on logistics, intelligence, and the ability to coordinate small bands over harsh terrain. Already the samurai way was learning its cruel arithmetic: rice into rations, trust into leverage, time into advantage. Back in Heian, the court continued as if on a parallel track: poetry contests and love affairs, rankings and ceremonies. Yet the regency's grip weakened as factions competed and emperors learned to retire without relinquishing influence. The system of cloistered rule, Insei, allowed retired emperors to pull strings from behind screens, creating a second center of power, where authority multiplies, loyalties split. Into those cracks poured warriors, seeking backing from whichever hand could write their names into lasting power. Now picture the tire crest of fluttering butterfly, delicate but everywhere. By the late 12th century, under Taira no Kiyomori, the Taira house rose like a tide. Kiyomori played court politics with the precision of a Go master, placing daughters in imperial circles and allies in key posts. He turned maritime trade into a weapon and patronized temples to varnish his ascent with piety. He seemed unstoppable until the Minamoto, exiled and diminished, began to stir. In this moment, fragile, charged, the samurai class began to look like itself. Not just men who fought, but men who organized fighting, who bound retainers by oath and reward, who stewarded estates and carved networks of obligation that outlived any one duel. They were still provincial, still disdainful of Heian's perfumes, but increasingly aware that they could do more than guard harvests. They could rule. The culture that coalesced around them was austere in public and spare in taste, yet not unfeeling. A warrior might compose a tanka in his saddle, while moonlight pooled on his cuirass. He learned to accept impermanence not as surrender, but as clarity. Things pass, therefore be exact. In the smell of horse sweat and wet hemp, new ethic took root. Loyalty that bound like iron bands, courage that did not brag, rectitude that cut cleanly, restraint that masked the ember of lethal force. Centuries later, people would call this Bushido the way of the warrior. In this first chapter of the class's birth, it was simply the habits required to survive and remain proud in dangerous country. The sword? It existed, yes. A curved blade beginning to replace straight continental forms, its edge born from folded steel and the patience of artisans who listened to fire. But in this first age the bow still ruled. Battles were announced with whistling signal arrows. Champions stepped forward to test each other at range. Horses snorted and pawed. Armor plates clicked. The sword hung at the hip like a second thought that would, in time, become the first.
Sleep draws near. Let the distant drums fade. We leave Heian's corridors where screens whisper and step onto muddy roads flanked by paddies already cut for harvest. The land is divided into estates, like a chessboard no one player fully controls. Two great houses shadow each other along the ridgelines. The air feels cold before the first frost. A courier rides hard toward a provincial manor, dust in his throat, and a message in his sleeve. War is about to lift its head and look toward the capital. When next you open your eyes, arrows will fly, banners will ripple, and Japan will meet its first age of warriors as rulers.
Dawn breaks on a field stitched with banners red and white, stag-antlered helmets, and high crests, bobbing like waves. The Genpei War, Gen for Minamoto, Hei for Taira, Peter took the country by the jaw and shook. It began not as a clean clash, but as a stutter of provocations and responses. An insult answered, an exile recalled, a faction protected, a child emperor enthroned, then fires kindled in one province, lit beacons in another, and suddenly marches lengthened into campaigns with their own weather, their own calendar written in smoke. The war unfolded between 1180 and 1185, a span short by imperial measures, but long enough to turn families into armies and songs into dirges. On the Taira side, the capital's pulse, Kiyomori's network, court posts, coastal control, a fleet that could shift warriors along inland seas faster than roads allowed. On the Minamoto side, hunger sharpened by years of exile, provincial ties hardened by struggle, and commanders who could combine pride with patience. The war's famous set pieces became lodestars in warrior memory: the river at Uji, the sea at Yashima, the cliff at Ichinotani, the final churn at Dan-no-Ura, where currents ran treacherous and fate turned with the tide. Pause at Uji, where a bridge became a strategy. Minamoto allies tore planks to slow pursuit, then stood among the gaps to loose arrows at Taira riders, forced into the water upstream. The scene catches the essence of early samurai conflict: decisive improvisation, terrain turned into a weapon, and courage measured in the breath it takes to knock a shaft under pressure. Move to Ichinotani, steep drop, reckless descent, where Minamoto troops surprised a Taira camp by charging down a slope, fought impassable. At Yashima, across water and wind, a Taira warlord set a fan upon a pole on a boat's stern, challenging Minamoto archery. A single shot, perfect and prideful, struck the fan, an image so bright it still flashes on painted screens. But artistry aside, the war bled supply. It tested lines of command, tested loyalty at the price point where rice met ransom, tested the ability to control men whose glory strained at the leash. Then Dan-no-Ura, the straight rough with whirlpools, the sky scoured by sea spray. The Taira fleet, experienced and nimble, met Minamoto ships carrying men who had made land their domain. Tides turned, literally. A tide chart consulted, or guessed at, bent the battle's spine. Betrayal mattered too. Pilots who revealed hidden currents to the enemy. Heralds who bellowed names, as if destiny were a person they knew. When it ended, the Taira were bold. Imperial regalia went into the water. The child emperor Antoku was carried by his grandmother into the sea, disappearing with an entire worldview in arms that had tried to hold on to both lineage and life. A chapter closed with a rush of foam against rock. From the spray rose a new architecture of power. Minamoto no Yoritomo, who had played the long game rather than the glorious charge, established his headquarters far from Heian's courtiers and gossip. In Kamakura, a coastal town hemmed by hills, he built something unprecedented: not a palace in the capital, but a government of war in the provinces, a scaffold of offices riveted directly to the muscle of the warrior class. The Bakufu, literally a tent government, a commander's field headquarters, became a permanent institution. Think of the Kamakura Bakufu as a lattice. At each joint, a promise, along each strand, rice and steel. Yoritomo appointed Shugo military governors to oversee provinces and Jito estate stewards, to manage specific lands, collect dues, and maintain order. The emperor and the court continued in Kyoto, reciting ceremonies and writing edicts, but the enforcement engine rumbled on roads leading to Kamakura. Yoritomo required personal oaths. He dispensed land to loyalists and revoked it from doubters. Law followed function. A separate legal system began to take shape for warriors, clearer on property, harsher on betrayal, exacting where honor intersected with administration. The samurai class found itself not merely recognized, but set at the center of a new political gravity. Kamakura's culture mirrored its geography, braced against seas and hills, spare, contained, disciplined. Zen Buddhism, arriving in drifts from the continent, found ready students in men who needed quiet in the mind to face noise in the world. A warrior sat cross-legged in a simple hall, focusing on breath and emptiness, then later adjusted a bowstring with the same steady hands. Tea moved from medicine to ritual. Monochrome ink paintings did with space what armors did with plates, left strength where needed and nothing extra. Swordsmiths became priests of flame. In their forges, tamahagane, iron sand smelted, folded and tempered, slept in billets like coiled dragons until awakening under hammer and water. The sword rose in symbolic rank, even as the bow remained tactically crucial. Samurai began to wear the long and the short katana and wakizashi badge and backup, logic and last resort. Yoritomo's death came early, and with it the first test of the new order. The Minamoto line did not hold the steering wheel for long. Regents from the Hoyo clan, Yoritomo's in-laws, took the reins with calm ruthlessness, ruling as shikken, caretakers, while puppet shoguns stood for ceremony. This might have shattered the system, but the Hoyo proved capable administrators. They convened the Hoyo Shu, a council for adjudication, codified precedents, and stabilized the jumble of oaths and grants that bound vassals to center. The result was paradoxical. An oligarchy that hardened customs into governance, stern yet predictable enough that a warrior could plan his family's future beyond the next skirmish. External storms arrived to test the walls. From the continent, a new empire flexed, Mongol rule in China and Korea, turning its gaze across narrow seas. Letters came first, demanding submission in terms that admitted no reply. Then ships, black silhouettes on the horizon like a punctuation mark, skeptics couldn't ignore. In 1274, the first invasion force struck Kaishu's shore. The Battle of Hakata Bay was unlike the duels samurai had dramatized in war tales. Mongol tactics used dense formations, coordinated drums and horns, siege weapons, and volleys of explosive projectiles. Samurai, trained in single combat announcements and ritual archery exchanges, met a swirling storm of massed warfare. Kamakura's defense adapted fast. After the invaders withdrew, whether from losses, logistics, or weather, Japan built a stone seawall along the vulnerable coast, mile after mile of labor and will. In 1281, the second invasion came larger, heavier, more determined. Japanese defenders used the wall well. They launched night raids in small boats, set fires, cut moorings, and turned the logistical superiority of the invader into a liability. A typhoon remembered as the divine wind, kamikaze tore through the anchored fleets. Ships broke, men drowned. The sea that had delivered conquerors devoured them. Survival is expensive. The Baikufu had mobilized the realm, and warriors had fought without the usual reward of new lands. There was no conquered province to distribute. Compensation became a puzzle with too few pieces. Promises stretched, resentments fermented. The Hoyo tightened controls accordingly, striking a balance between rewarding valor and preserving a treasury dented by emergency. Culture, meanwhile, thickened. Zen's language of sudden insight and disciplined practice stamped itself deep into warrior aesthetics. No drama began to crystallize from older performance forms. Slow movement, spare verse, masks that held emotion in tension like a calm face before a duel. The tea room distilled power down to a tatami square, where a lord learned humility pouring water, and the steam carried lessons for governance, attention, economy, timing, call it an ethic of clean lines. The class that had risen in dust and mud learned to prize brevity and silence as vehicles for precision. Yet cracks widened. In the court, the Emperor Go-Daigo harbored designs on actual power, not just rights. In 1331, he moved to undo the warrior government's supremacy. The attempt failed, then rekindled. Provinces split into loyalists and imperial supporters. Old alliances re-rated like rivers after an earthquake. A brilliant general, Kusunoki Masashige, emerged famed for strategic patience and unwavering devotion, fighting for the imperial cause. The tale of his last stand and death would feed the warrior imagination for centuries, the ideal of loyalty that prefers a clean ending to an easy compromise. By 3033, Kamakura fell. Rebel armies breached its defences. The Hojo regents perished in fire. For a trembling moment, called the Meiji Restoration, imperial rule returned not as symbol but as governing fact. Go-Daigo envisioned a world where land returned to court control, where warriors bent knee as servants rather than partners. He misread the new Japan. Land had become oath and livelihood for samurai across the archipelago. They expected acknowledgement, offices and security within the system their ancestors had built with blood. When those expectations met imperial decrees that smelled like the Heian of old, friction sparked. Enter Ashikaga Takagi, a general first dispatched to suppress the imperial rebellion, who switched sides, then switched the balance. He drove on Kyoto, installed a rival emperor, and set the pattern for a new shogunate with himself as its axis. The realm split between two imperial lines, northern and southern courts, both draped in legitimacy, both tethered to competing warrior coalitions. The Kamakura design had taught Japan that power could live outside Kyoto. The Ashikaga period would teach it that power could live inside Kyoto and still be defined by warlords who set rules amidst shifting loyalties, art and ash. As you drift toward the edge of sleep, imagine Kamakura's gravel lanes emptied after curfew, only the sea's breath and the distant clack of a night patrol's wooden clappers to mark the hour. In the forges, swords cool to a soft hiss. On a low table, a cup of tea sends one thin ribbon of steam upward, a straight line in the lamplight. The country has survived storms sent by a world-ruling horse-archer empire and found faith in its own winds. Yet victory without spoils has left pockets light and tempers heavier than armor. In the capital, a determined emperor writes edicts. Down the Tokaido road, a warlord reads the weather and decides which way to lean. Ahead lie fractal wars and delicate arts, gardens groomed to perfection beside castles engineered for siege. The longbow giving way to matchlocks, then sharing space with both the sword moving from symbol to sentence. Ahead, tea rooms that hosted treaties and fields that ruined them. Ahead, a century and more when Japan would be many Japans at once. Each province a possibility, each lord a problem, each oath a bridge that might burn as it's crossed. Night settles over Kyoto like ink poured into a basin, and the capital breathes as if it has lungs. Lanterns mark alleys, Shutters blink, temple bells fold the hours into layers. Yet the city restored as the seat of power after Kamakura's fall is not a singular thing. It's a mirror held up to another mirror, reflections bending into two courts, southern and northern, emperor against emperor, each draped in brocade, each backed by steel. The Meiji Restoration promised a return to ancient clarity, the emperor's writ flowing across paddies and mountains, unimpeded. But Japan had learned a new grammar: oath, stipend, office, written in the handwriting of warriors. When wishes met structures, the structures won. Ashikaga Takauji, a commander with a cautious eye and a quick blade, crossed the river from instrument to actor. First tasked to suppress the emperor's allies, he instead read the weather and became the weather. With the backing of restless samurai who felt slighted by court reforms, he entered Kyoto and installed a rival sovereign. From that moment, legitimacy split like a crack through a tea bowl, elegant, branching, irreversible. For decades, banners rose and fell, castles changed hands. Season followed season, as if nothing were wrong and everything was wrong. The southern court held moral gravity for many, the line of Go-Daigo, stubborn, austere, unwilling to surrender its claim. The northern court held the city, the bureaucracy, the rhythms of governance. Armies marched under both suns. In this complicated sky, a new political creature grew to its full size. The daimyo, the great name, a regional lord who could field troops, manage tax flows, build fortifications, and negotiate between ideals and reality. The Ashikaga shogunate, rooted in Kyoto rather than an offshore stronghold, ruled through texture rather than weight. It wove alliances into tapestries, gorgeous if seen from a distance, fragile if tugged at each corner. The first Ashikaga Takauji learned to concede enough to keep warriors fed and proud while maintaining the staging of imperial ritual. His heirs, some strong, some not, inherited a system that required presence, patience, and taste. For culture had become a lever of power. The shogunate's patronage forged a canon, gardens that compressed landscapes into 4 stones and raked gravel, monochrome scrolls where bamboo groves implied courage through restraint. No drama that turned stillness into thunder, tea that walked from apothecary to altar, and discovered that simplicity could bend the backs of the mighty. And Zen monks crossed boundaries between meditation hall and chancery. They drafted letters, arranged trade with the continent, curated art collections that doubled as soft diplomacy. Under Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, brilliant, theatrical, the capital gleamed. He raised the Kitayama Palace, and later the Golden Pavilion, Kinkaku, a layered dream shimmering above a pond. Each reflection suggesting that power too is a kind of choreography. The shogun styled himself with titles that stitched him into the imperial fabric, and peered across the sea with a merchant's appetite and a courtier's poise. For a moment, the realm felt balanced on a fingertip, fragile, resplendent, possible. Balance never lasts. Court extravagance required silver and rice. Rice required order. Order demanded force. The mass of the country valleys, river basins, hilltop fortresses rested on local men whose loyalty depended not on poetry parties, but on the predictability of reward. When shogunal succession wavered, factions grew teeth. Provincial families, Hosokawa, Yamana, Hatakayama, Shiba, learned that being kingmaker is a habit difficult to drop. In Kyoto's narrow streets, a quarrel over who should be guardian to a child, shogun could set warehouses ablaze miles away. The Onin War, 1467-1477, did not begin as apocalypse. It began as a political dispute. swollen by pride. Two magnate houses backed rival heirs. Alliances cross-hatched the city into death traps. Roof tiles fell. Arrow slits opened. Fire ran ridgelines like a giggling child, careless and cruel. 10 years of urban siege taught every resident the taste of ash. The capital emptied, the shogun's authority, already a choreography of gesture and compromise, thinned to theatre without stagehands. When smoke finally lifted, Kyoto was a skeleton of itself. The shogunate survived in name, thin silk stretched over a broken drum, but the rhythm it once commanded now came from elsewhere. Out in the provinces, daimyo consolidated. They built Yamashiro mountain castles by the dozens, then the hundreds, nodes of power stitched to river routes and granaries. They broke and remade laws, not in rebellion against order but in pursuit of it, a local order, harsh and direct. They rewrote succession rules to favor competency over primogeniture, a pragmatic treason against tradition that made sense where arrows decided schedules. They surveyed land and measured harvests, recorded village obligations with a clerk's cold pen, and negotiated with merchants who knew that coin could move faster than packhorse trains. This was the age when temple complexes could be governments, when warrior monks Sohei guarded tolls and doctrine with equal zeal. Peasant leagues, Iki, arose in fits and flashes, sometimes to protest taxes, sometimes to topple a lord, sometimes to install their own rough justice. Markets multiplied, regional specialties hardened into identities, lacquer here, swords there, salt everywhere, and money's clink grew as persuasive as rank. The class that had put its faith in the bow and blade now had to tan paper, abacuses, and double-entry ledgers. Those who learned thrived. Those who didn't found themselves politely escorted out of history. Culturally, restraint deepened even as politics grew wild. Tea masters drew lines straighter, rooms smaller, gestures more demanding. In the tea room's hush, a daimyo could discover both dignity and a new kind of vulnerability. To sit, to bow, to handle a cup, is to admit that power requires rhythm. Gardeners inscribed mountains inside courtyards. Poets found the pivot word to turn a season into a sigh. Even warlords sought balance in aesthetics, as if beauty might anchor them against the currents they themselves summoned. As decades passed, the long civil weather learned a new name, Sengoku, the warring states. It wasn't chaos, it was a competitive ecology. Domains weren't simply held, they were justified by competence, defended by innovation, enlarged by timely marriages, and appropriately ruthless knights. Spears grew longer, formations tighter, signal flags and drums organized movement at scales earlier ages would have called impossible. The bow still sang, the sword still settled close arguments, but the spear line wrote the first sentence of most battles, and soon something stranger would arrive to rearrange the paragraph. Step back and let your breath slow. Imagine a map in flickering lamplight, provinces painted in different inks, edges smudged, arrows drawn, erased, redrawn. The capital still shines, but its light does not command shadows as it once did. Instead, dozens of small suns burn across the archipelago, each with satellites, ambitions, and schedules. In the still room of tea, a lord tastes bitter leaf and thinks sweetly of victory. On a castle's rampart, a watchman listens for the first faint rumour of a return no one expects. Ships from the south, strangers with fire in their tubes, and names that sound like the sea. At first, they were curiosities, the strangers and their thundersticks. In 1543, A storm pushed a Chinese junk carrying Portuguese traders onto a small southern island. Islanders examined the metal tubes that bucked like stallions and spat fire. The technology was simple in theory, complicated in practice. Powder, spark, ball, and a wooden stock sturdy enough to hold the moment. Within months, within years, Japan absorbed the idea and refined the craft. Tanegashima became a synonym for matchlock. Artisans in Sakai and other towns took apart the imports, retooled, improved, wore reeds quickly. Firearms did not erase older skills. They repurposed them. Samurai learned to rank their fights by distance. Matchlocks at the front for the first shock, arrows singing over their heads, spears bristling like a wheat field in wind. The sword saving its intimacy for when fields kink into alleys of flesh and wool. Warlords with bookkeepers became warlords with drill sergeants. Rows of a shigaru, foot soldiers, stood behind small wooden shields and learned to time their volleys to the beat of a commander's breath. Weather mattered, terrain mattered, discipline mattered more. Into this world stepped Oda Nobunaga, a man who looked at old patterns and saw angles where others saw walls. He came from Owari, not the loftiest lineage, but his talents were mathematical. He measured risk with a jeweler's loop. Nobunaga understood that loyalty follows reward and certainty. He paid soldiers in coin and land. He crushed resistance with speed so theatrical, it taught faster than edicts. He took Kyoto in 1568, not as a pilgrim but as an engineer of outcomes, installing an Ashikaga shogun as a polite mask while he rearranged the skull beneath. Nobunaga's wars were laboratory and stage. At Nagashino 1575, he faced the cavalry of the Takeda men who had turned mounted shock into poetry. Nobunaga did the impolite thing. He built fences, layered his gunners, and turned the field into a mechanism. The charge met wood and powder, horses fell, momentum died. The story, cleaned by time, makes it seem as if matchlocks alone decided the day. In truth, the invention was integration, spears to plug gaps, bows to harass, cavalry to exploit recoil in the enemy's spirit. The lesson stuck. In the Sengo calculus, novelty wins only when married to logistics. He built too, because building is a kind of war. Azuchi Castle rose by Lake Biwa like a cliff cut into geometry, broad stone skirts, soaring timber trunk, a watchtower's crown painted with the taste of someone who would not apologize for wanting the world to know he owned it. On its terraces, tea could be poured and treaties quietly drafted. On its gates, severed heads could cool. Nobunaga patronized merchants, raised markets, treated coin as a weapon and a lever. He broke the power of armed temples that had sat astride trade routes as both robe and spear. He made enemies aggregated by resentment and philosophical pretext. In 1582, betrayal came from within. Akechi Mitsuhide, a vassal who calculated that the moment had ripened, struck at Honnoji, a temple in Kyoto where Nobunaga lodged. Fire ate the buildings. Nobunaga died by his own hand rather than be taken. For 3 days, Japan held its breath. Then Toyotomi Hideyoshi exhaled for it. Born a peasant, Hideyoshi rose along the ladders. Nobunaga built. Clever, tireless, capable of reading the temperature of a room, as if it were written on the steam above tea. He moved like poured mercury to defeat Mitsuhide, inherited Nobunaga's coalition, and performed the most difficult trick in politics. He kept it. With patience lacquered over steel, he subdued rival daimyo by siege, siege again, and relentless negotiation. He could be lavish, tender, brutal, in exacting doses. Castles bloomed. Osaka, a mountain of masonry, handling the sky like an equal. Roads were surveyed. post station standardized, barriers placed, measures measured. The country that had been a conversation among swords became a spreadsheet with spears in the margins. Hideyoshi codified. He ordered land surveys. Taiko Kenchi, that counted not acres but kokodaka, the imagined rice output of a field, turning yield into the language of obligation. He drew the class lines with a firm brush. The sword hunt disarmed peasants, removing the possibility of farm tools becoming uprising tools, and sharpening the samurai identity into exclusivity. To carry two swords was to be what you were on paper. Merchants gained power in town grids. Artisans found steady demand. Villages learned the pace of taxation and anger, which sometimes shared a roof. Culture did not gild this order, it co-authored it. Hideyoshi adored spectacle. Gold-screened rooms, where tea bowls from China sat like small emperors, and Japanese chowan, thick and asymmetrical, could steal the show with a quietness more compelling than glitter. The tea master Senno Rikyu refined wabi, the beauty of austerity, into law. In a room the size of a pause, a warlord could rehearse abdication of ego and then return to his siege with a calmer hand. Tea became politics with fewer witnesses. And yet Hideyoshi could not resist horizons. In the 1590s, restless for a project that matched his appetite, he turned to the continent. Korea Choshon was both obstacle and corridor, the road to Ming China. Twice he launched invasions that moved with terrifying speed along the peninsula's waist. Japanese troops, hardened by domestic campaigns, met Chinese and Korean defenders who adapted with naval raids, mobile artillery, and the indomitable turtle ships of Admiral Yi Sun-sin. The wars wrecked cities, villages, lives. Logistics stretched thin across seas and winter. After years of attrition and stalemate, the armies came home. Hideyoshi died in 1598 with a child heir and an unfinished plan. The coalition he'd glued together with charisma and consequences began to creep. Enter Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man with a tortoise's patience and a hawk's stare. He had survived as hostage, ally, rival, and friend in turn to the greats who preceded him. When Nobunaga cut and Hideyoshi cast, Ieyasu cured slow, steady, deliberate. When the Toyotomi Regency frayed, Ieyasu gathered strands with modest hands and an iron spool. The decisive reckoning came not in a city, but in a valley, Sekigahara, 1600 in fog and autumn damp. 2 leagues of alliances faced each other, their banners heavy with old favours and new doubts. Midday, a wing faltered. A general turned his coat at the precise moment. The fog lifted like a curtain, obeying a stage cue. Ieyasu sighed the eastern army, held and then rolled the line. The battle did not merely decide a day, it decided the orbital paths of hundreds of domains. With victory came architecture again, this time of an even longer arc. In 1603, Ieyasu accepted the title shogun and planted his government, not in Kyoto, but in Edo, a fishing town fattened by canals, ambition, and good geography. He kept the emperor's radiance in the old capital, and wrapped it like a relic, respected, untouchable, politically contained. In Edo, carpenters and scribes raised a government that called itself Bakufu, but behaved like a weather system, pervasive, shaping, predictable, and hard to fight. The Tokugawa settlement did not abolish daimyo. It domesticated them. Territories were measured in kokodaka, obligations tiered accordingly, alternate attendants. Sankin Kotai required lords to split their lives between Edo and their domains, leaving families as elegant collateral in the shogun's city. Roads improved to carry processions, feudal theatre staged as national infrastructure. Castle building was limited by edict. Marriages required approval. Alliances were webbed and monitored. The sword remained the badge of the class, but its function softened, less a day-to-day tool, more a ceremonial punctuation mark. In towns, a new world grew. Merchants, officially low in moral rank, became high in leverage. Rice moved through their hands, money multiplied, fashions flowed downstream from daimyo wardrobes, and upstream from theatre districts. Artisans made everything from blades to ukiyo prints that would later astonish the West, woodblock windows into floating worlds of actors, courtesans, wrestlers, seasons. Literacy widened. Temple schools taught reading, writing, and abacus to children who would never touch a spear. Confucian ethics provided a scaffold for social behavior. Village codes taught cooperation sharpened by responsibility. Within this order, the samurai identity changed in slow focus. The warrior of Kamakura had been a rider, an archer, a steward by necessity. The Sengoku samurai had been a professional of campaign, drill, march, siege, negotiate, repeat. The Edo samurai became something else. A bureaucrat with a blade, a scholar whose stipend often outran his purse, a moral exemplar in theory and a debtor in practice. Their writings turned inward, manuals of conduct, treatises on loyalty and death, reflections on the paradox of carrying steel in a time designed to keep it sheathed. Bushido, once lived and unspoken, began to be written, not as a single book, but as a chorus of voices trying to codify the posture that had allowed their ancestors to stand while the world burned. Yet, for all the softness compared to prior centuries, steel still existed and cut. The early Tokugawa period saw rebellions, peasant riots sparked by taxes and famine. A Christian uprising in Shimabara crushed by overwhelming force, occasional conspiracies in shadowed corridors where ambitious retainers measured their lord's weaknesses. The state learned to prevent rather than punish. Surveillance as policy, balance as reflex. Foreign ships appeared more often, then less, then more again. Policies on trade and faith tightened, formalized, and set the archipelago's heartbeat to a slower maritime rhythm. For the first time in centuries, generations could die in bed more often than in the field.
But we are ahead of ourselves. Return to the turn of the century, to Edo still smelling of fresh-cut timber and wet earth, to Kyoto where the emperor's procession is a moving poem, to Osaka where warehouses are as sacred as altars. The country has been stitched from fractals into a fabric. 3 men signed the hem with different inks. Nobunaga's red, Hideyoshi's gold, Ieyasu's black. Behind them stand countless others, engineers who learned to bend rivers, tea masters who taught warlords how to sit still, smiths who made edges that remember the hands that held them.
Close your eyes. Hear boots on stone stairs, spiraling within a keep. Hear the soft swish of a silk cord, tying a sword to a waist. Hear merchants haggling in a market where sea salt, lacquer, sake and scrolls sit shoulder to shoulder. The bow still hums in some valley at dawn. The matchlock's fuse still smoulders like a patient thought. The sword sleeps, dangerous even in dreams. The samurai, no longer merely a profession but a class with rules, enters a long age of peace in which memory becomes doctrine and posture becomes philosophy. Morning in Edo arrives with footsteps more than trumpets. The river barges come first, sliding under bridges with the steadiness of a practiced breath. Then shop fronts open, paper doors sliding, clacks and thuds lined up like punctuation. In the castle compound, drums mark the hours, but for most of the city, time is counted in rice deliveries and ledger lines. This is peace, not the sleepy kind that forgets danger, but the trained kind that remembers and chooses stillness anyway. It rests like a sword laid flat with its edge turned away. The Tokugawa system understands men as much as it understands maps. Daimyo rotate to Edo in elegant caravans, Sankin Kotai, half ceremony, half leash. In their home provinces, they govern with a schedule imprinted into the land: spring surveys, summer roads, autumn taxes, winter storehouse checks. In Edo, they attend councils, bow at the right angles, and learn the rhythms of a polity designed to disperse ambition into ritual. Each domain keeps hostages by another name, wives and heirs lodged in Edo's neighborhoods, their households both gilded and watched. It is a governance by geometry, triangles of obligation, circles of courtesy, lines that cannot be crossed without all seeing. Samurai fill the interstices of this geometry. Some still practice on dojo floors the thud of wooden swords and the hiss of straw targets receiving cuts. Many more hold brushes. Their stipends are measured in kokodok arithmetic, and the math rarely flatters appetite. In long rows of offices, clerks tie scrolls with neat cords as if binding drifting thoughts. A retainer spends his afternoon translating a farmer's petition into the language of policy, then returns home to a house where the sword has its corner and the inkstone its own. Pride learns to be quiet without going cold. The cutting edge remains, honed nightly in small decisions. To be honest in accounts, to correct a subordinate without humiliation, to accept a rebuke without cracking inside. In this long season, the Shido begins to write itself, less a single book, and more a climate. Monks, magistrates, fencing masters, and minor lords put brush to paper, each trying to describe the animal they ride. Some stress death as readiness, not as morbid worship, but as a gauge. If you can look at loss without flinching, you can weigh the day properly. Others emphasize benevolence and restraint. The strong must be soft, where softness preserves order. Confucian lectures pour like tea across tatami mats. Hierarchy as duty, ritual as glue, learning as armor. Zen sits in the corner, smiling at both, asking its wordless questions. Who moves when you raise your hand? What is the sound of the world when you stop naming it? Training follows suit. Sword schools proliferate, each a grammar for motion. One treats the blade like calligraphy, strokes flowing with breath. Another favors minimalism, a single cut that contains all others. Archery shifts from battlefield to right. The longbow, once chorus, becomes soloist in the meditative hush of Kyudo halls, where target and archer compensate for a world that refuses certainty. Spear arts survive in dojo drills that remember how formations used to behave. Armorsmiths work less, but finer. Their laced plates become heirlooms, worn on festivals that keep the taste of danger without the blood. Outside official ranks, the city teaches its own lessons. Kabuki theaters glitter, courtesan, quarters make beauty a profession. Storytellers turn old battles into moral puzzles anyone can carry home. Ukiyo-e carvers set actors' faces and seasonal blossoms onto blocks that travel far beyond the neighborhoods that birthed them. The floating world. Ukiyo is both an escape and a mirror, impermanence wrapped in color, instructing viewers in the art of letting go without surrendering joy. A samurai off-duty might slip into those streets and feel for a moment both scandal and relief, then stand straighter the next morning, having remembered why posture matters. The countryside adjusts to this new equilibrium. Villages become institutions, self-governed, under a lattice of obligations to their domain, temples, and shrines. Headmen keep registers like rosaries. Water-sharing agreements matter as much as prayers for rain. Peasant households specialize. fertilizer becomes commerce. Harvests fluctuate with weather, but trend upward under orderly rule. Famines still come. The climate has its own politics, and when they do, resentment can spark like kindling. The shogunate learns to read the barometer, price controls in a bad year, granary releases, stern words for speculators, sometimes punishments public enough to make example shape habit. From the sea the world knocks now and then. Dutch traders slide into Nagasaki's artificial island of Dejima, bringing lenses, books and stories that seem as far-fetched as they are precise. Rangaku Dutch learning slips through the gate. Samurai in spectacles translate anatomy and astronomy. Physicians compare herbs. Mathematicians play with new ways of counting what the eye cannot. Curiosity competes with caution. Edicts about foreign faiths remain severe. Crosses are forbidden. The memory of the Shimabara uprising and its Christian banners lingers like smoke woven into thatch. Time passes like a slow river. Generation takes over from generation. Stipends erode in buying power as coinage reforms wobble under the weight of competing needs. Some samurai sell heirlooms quietly to keep the rice jar filled. Others take side work in tutoring, fencing instruction, town magistracy. Pride survives, transforms, writes its memoirs as aphorisms pinned to dojo walls. Economy is the blade scabbard. Patience is a siege without walls. Kindness is control, in disguise. The class's myths sharpen even as its daily tasks soften. They recite the tales of Minamoto, Taira, and those three men who made one country. It is medicine, and like good medicine, it tastes slightly bitter. Under the lacquer, strange shows. In some domains, fiscal reformers insist on frugality with a ferocity that eats the poor first. In others, reform pretends, and debt grows like a vine. Merchants, officially low in the moral order, quietly become indispensable, their silver fixing roads and reputations alike. They loan to samurai at rates that transfer memory as well as money. A family line can end not with the blade but with the ledger. Resentment accumulates like silt, reshaping channels in ways rulers prefer not to notice. When you walk Edo at twilight, you can hear the equilibrium hum. A palanquin passes with soft footfalls. A fishmonger calls prices. The castle unfurls its outline against a sky, learning the colour of ink. On a side street, a fencing master corrects a student's grip with 2 fingers. Your hand is a thought, he says. Make it a decision. The student nods. Tomorrow, he will copy records on tax exemptions. Tonight he practices the cut that proves to himself he could still do what his ancestors did if the world asked. The world, for now, does not. Yet the ocean is patient. Far beyond Dejima, ships drill horizons. Flags you haven't seen yet. Taste the wind that one day will push them into your harbour. The sword on its stand is both symbol and question. Peace is a balance pose. Few can hold it forever without a tremor. Close your eyes and let the great city dim. Tea cools in a cup the size of a moon's fingernail. Somewhere a poet writes a haiku about winter light on a guard's spear. Somewhere a clerk adds a column, twice to be sure. The land rests, paired with law, married to habit. The samurai, sheathed and standing, learn to be their own scabbards. The edge is there, invisible, in time. One summer morning, the horizon changes shape. Sails like thunderheads, hulls painted with a darkness that eats sunlight. In 1853, Commodore Perry's black ships enter Edo Bay, and the city that has trained itself to hear danger before it speaks hears cannons before they fire. The visitors are polite and impossible. Their letters blend negotiation with threat. their ships can move even when the wind declines to help them. The long Edo calculus balance, ritual, control, stutters, then miscounts. The Bakufu chooses delay, study, then concession. Treaties follow unequal by design, prying open ports, capping tariffs, insisting on extraterritoriality. The parchment scratches, but the echo is steel. Domestic legitimacy begins to leak. Towns crowd the docks to gawk. Scholars argue, commoners tally prices, and notice that silk now has foreign roots and foreign prices. The letters are in English and Dutch, but anger finds its own script. Sono yoi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The slogan carries a paradox in its sheath. It says, unify to close, yet the skills needed to close require opening. Those who shout it loudest will learn the irony most deeply. The country divides along a new seam that hides older ones. Pro-Bakufu pragmatists versus imperial loyalists, many from outside the Tokugawa heartland. Satsuma in the south, Choshu to the west, domains that had long memories of being watched. Each hosts samurai who are tired of stipends that thin and edicts that wobble. Each cultivates students who carry swords and notebooks with equal zeal. They read Western military manuals under oil lamps. They train with Dutch rifles while reciting poetry about ancient emperors. Some adopt Western jackets over hakama. Others keep crests on sleeves and flint in fuses. All learn to aim. Assassinations multiply in Kyoto's alleys. Men cut down for being too open to foreigners, or not open enough. The imperial court, long a jewel in a box, becomes a locus of plots, appeals and sudden deaths. The shogunate reforms too late, too carefully, then swings too hard. New councils, new arsenals, new ships that feel like old ships pretending to be new. A shogun sails to meet the emperor and returns with more ceremony than certainty. Peasant uprisings spark as taxes and prices misalign. Merchants hedge. Money moves in channels that no one planned for, and everyone now depends on. Choshu fires on foreign vessels in the Shimonoseki Strait. Foreign squadrons answer with bombardment that turns literal what had been metaphor for decades. The shore is no longer guarantee. Satsuma fights British ships in Kagoshima's bay, then sends students to Britain after the smoke clears. Defeat polished into policy by leaders with minds like knives wrapped in silk. Gunsmiths expand, factories breathe. Samurai learn to drill in mines rather than duel, by appointment. Telegraph lines hum, steam whistles scold the old rhythms. Swords remain, are revered, and yet the matchlock's descendant, the rifle, writes faster on the page of battle. In 1867, the last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, reads the weather remembered by his ancestors. Power resists too long, only to break uglier. He returns governing authority to the emperor in a gesture as dramatic as it is incomplete, hoping to lead a reformed government from beneath a new banner. His rivals do not intend to share. Decrees flow from Kyoto, now a political furnace. The Bakufu's remnants reorganize. The imperial coalition consolidates. The problem becomes simple enough for war to solve. The Boshin War opens like a gate. Toba, Fushimi, cannon smoke drifting over riverbanks, banners on both sides writing their claims on air. Many samurai still wear swords, but the battles belong to units that know how to load, fire, and reload in rain. Some domains switch allegiance in mid-campaign with the frankness of survival. Others hold out with tragedy's elegance. Edo surrenders largely without a fight, under the mediation of men who will be founders. The castle's gates, used to ceremony, learn the creak of capitulation. Northern domains unite briefly As the Uetsu Reppan Domei, they fight hard, lose steadily, and give over their arsenals. The shogunate's last ships raise a white sun flag in Hokkaido, declare a short-lived republic, and are broken at sea off Hakodate by forces that now include ironclads. The chapter ends not with a single duel, but with a list of terms signed in a room where tea cools untouched. The new government calls itself Meiji, enlightened rule, and moves fast. Feudal domains become prefectures, stipends become bonds, then decline. Resident lords are told to move to Tokyo, and their castles learn to be museums, schools, or empty outlines on hills. Class banners come down in law, if not in memory. Swords remain for a time, then are regulated, then are mostly ornaments. Conscription builds an army from the entire nation, not just a warrior caste using French drill, then Prussian discipline, then its own synthesis. Railroads sprout, factories drill day and night. A constitution is drafted, the emperor rides a train. The men who once recited Bushido now write modern civil codes and military regulations in which those old virtues go to work in new uniforms. That transformation is both surgical and savage. Samurai with small stipends, stripped of hereditary purpose, confront a world that measures merit in exams and markets. Some become teachers, many become policemen or bureaucrats. A few become criminals by desperation and pride. Others take their own lives with gestures borrowed from the theatre of older honour. On the margins, discontent collects like gunpowder. In 1877, that powder lights in Satsuma, the very domain that helped unmake the old order. Saigo Takamori, a man of immense gravity and personal virtue, who had raised the imperial banner only years before, returns to petition, and then to arms, drawing thousands of former samurai into an army weighted by memory. He fights knowing the math rifles, artillery, railways and factories tilt the scales against him. The Satsuma rebellion tears through Kyushu like a storm made of ghosts and duty. It ends as storms end, exhausted, spent against walls it cannot move. Saigo dies on a hillside, wrapped in legend, even as his cause, the privileged, hereditary sword, dies with him as policy. And yet the samurai do not vanish. They diffuse. Their virtues, arguments, and contradictions seep into the state that replaced them. Military academies teach discipline with old words and new drills. Police manuals talk about rectitude as if it were a weapon. Businessmen borrow fealty to build firms, calling loyalty by other names. Schools teach classics beside science, calligraphy beside geometry. In literature, the samurai becomes a mirror in which a modern nation watches itself wrestle with strength and softness, duty and desire. The sword, too, refuses to be only relic. Kendo codifies strikes that once decided lordship into safe, fierce play. Iaido preserves the draw as meditation, cutting not an enemy but one's own hesitation. In quiet dojos, bamboo swords sting the wrist and tenderize the ego. In museums, old blades sleep under glass, their hammer lines like frozen weather fronts, each curve the fossil of a smith decision in a century that had other priorities. On festival days, you'll still see armor lacquer glinting, and children will measure themselves against helmets taller than their pride. Beyond the archipelago, the new nation shocks neighbors and far powers with competence. Victories against King China and then Imperial Russia tell a story in which factories and schedules, not banners and boasting, write outcomes at home. Thinkers argue whether the old warrior spirit fueled these new feats, or whether it is being mythologized into a tonic the state serves too strong. The question marks bloom in newspapers and novels. Meanwhile, citizens climb trains and go to work. If you stand today on a headland above Hakata Bay, where Mongol ships once tangled and the divine wind learned its name, you might hear nothing but ocean and gulls. The seawall stones from Kamakura days are long sunk or recycled into later dreams. Yet, if you listen differently, patience reveals a second sound, a long, low chord played for centuries by horsehair and bowstring, by matchlock and cannon, by brush on paper and foot on tatami. It is the sound of a class becoming a story, and a story becoming a country. As night drifts in, imagine a small house in Edo turned Tokyo, late in the 19th century. On the alcove shelf sits a sword wrapped in cloth. Beside it, an abacus and a Western book on steam engines. A grandson asks his grandfather what the sword did. The old man says it taught my hand to be still when my mind wanted to shake. The boy nods, not fully understanding, then returns to his homework on geography and physics. Outside, the city lights thicken. The samurai began as riders with bows, became officers of estates, then engineers of nationhood without choosing to be. They learned austerity under Zen lamps, and spent stipends in theatre alleys. They could compose a poem in the saddle, and sign a death warrant in neat script. They carried contradictions like other men carry tools. They are gone, and they are everywhere. Let sleep take you now through a gate of bamboo, onto a path gritted with sand that remembers sandals and sabatons both. In the distance, a temple bell keeps time for a city whose clocks no longer need it. The blade rests in its scabbard, the scabbard rests on the shelf, and the shelf holds both past and present without creaking. The story of the samurai is done changing shape for tonight. In the next chapters, we'll walk the museums, forges, and dojos of memory. We'll track how film, games, and global culture remade the warrior into a modern myth. We'll sit once more with tea as a nation teaches the world to breathe between cities. Morning over Tokyo, sometime after the railways had learned the city's pulse. Whistles, footfalls, a newspaper boy calling headlines that braid steel with politics. The sword on the shelf remains wrapped in cloth, and the men who once carried its twins carry ledgers, rifles, statutes, and syllabi. The class dissolved, but its posture lingered, a muscle memory in the nation's back. The question that woke with the Meiji sun, never fully slept again: what do you keep when you must change everything? The first answers were practical. Schools, national, compulsory, rose like crops across the islands. In their classrooms, boys and girls recited kana, traced kanji, drew maps of a world that suddenly had borders and timetables, not horizons and seasons. Some teachers were former samurai who traded stipends for salaries and top knots for trimmed hair. Chalk replaced the sword as the instrument that corrected errors. Discipline bent without breaking. Children learned to line up, bow, listen, speak, habits that had once trained men for formations, now trained citizens for factories and parliaments. Factories smoked like new volcanoes, forging rails, textiles, ships. Engineers visited Germany and Britain and returned with notebooks thick as armor. Lawyers studied French codes and German constitutional theory, then argued in Japanese about how to translate duty into rights and rights into duties. Good steel in every age is a blend. Mix too much of one element and the blade shatters, too little and it bends. The Meiji blend hardened through error, debate, and occasional cruelty. Villages learned the cost of conscription, sons gone for years, wives and grandparents weighing absence against wages. Yet soldiers returned with skills, stories, and an identity larger than the valley between two hills. In the barracks, the army wrote a catechism of obedience that sounded like Bushido with brass buttons. Loyalty pivoted from lord to emperor. The willingness to die, once a private ethic of a class, became a public virtue of a nation. The Navy learned from Britain how to move a fleet with mathematics and weather sense. The army learned from Prussia how to align doctrine with rail schedules. Scholars argued, was the spirit of the warrior the engine of victory, or was it the machine's careful oiling? The state answered, both. In that answer, glory and danger shook hands. Culturally, the samurai stepped onto new stages. On film stock, a young director aimed his lens at weather and faces and made old stories breathe in modern rooms. Actors wearing crests, some only with their eyes, turned loyalty and doubt into long takes. Jidaigeki, period drama, found that the samurai could carry a nation's anxieties on his shoulders without talking much. In novels, ex-samurai wandered cities in coats that fit poorly, wrestling with principles that fit too tightly. Essays defended the old virtues while confessing the old blind spots. Painters borrowed Western perspective and shadow without surrendering line and emptiness. Composers wrote marches and lullabies with equal precision. Swords, meanwhile, were legislated first into nostalgia, then into museum cases, then into a paradox, forbidden in the street, revered in the mind. Some families hid blades through hard years, others sold them to collectors who didn't pronounce their names quite right. A new category formed in the civic imagination, art sword. The weapon became an object of national heritage, the edge not for cutting men, but for slicing time to reveal its cross-section. Swordsmiths registered, taught, received designations that were secular beatifications, living national treasures, men whose hammers timed their hearts. The 20th century's middle brought the loudest misreading. Politicians and generals, faced with the arithmetic of empire, reached for old language to justify new appetites. They chiseled Bushido into slogans and served it to boys in classrooms where maps stretched beyond prudence. A virtue made for small rooms and personal oaths was stretched across islands and continents until it thinned. Heroism multiplied, as did tragedy. Letters from fronts, folded like birds, carried both. When defeat arrived, it was not a student's correction, but a structural collapse. Cities burned. The emperor spoke over radio, voice thin on air as if coming from a different century. Swords were stacked and taken, or hidden and wept over. After surrender, the nation asked again what to keep. Occupation authorities distrusted the myths that had marched, and yet they found in the culture a reservoir of quiet strength, patience, craft, a genius for retooling. The martial arts shifted from soldiering to schooling. Kendo and judo re-emerged as sports. Their spiritual language cleaned of fever but not of fire. Children learned to bow to each other before they struck. Respect and restraint wrapped competition like a belt. Aido conceived of cutting hesitation rather than enemies. Kyudo turned the bow's long line into a meditation on distance that included the distance between thought and action. Economy replaced conquest as the shared endeavor. In boardrooms with carpets instead of tatami, executives built firms that resembled domains, structural loyalty, obligations in both directions, morning calisthenics that made factories move like disciplined companies. The salaryman, for better and worse, wore the ghost of armor under his suit. He was expected to sacrifice, to stay late, to think of the firm as family, to live a code that promised dignity and delivered exhaustion as often as pride. Writers and directors asked again whether this was honor refined or obligation deformed. The answers varied, as answers must in a modern nation that permitted many. Abroad, the samurai escaped the borders of their history and became emblems with lives of their own. A child in Paris thrilled to a movie about a bodyguard who fought for peasants. A teenager in Sao Paulo taped a sword poster over a samba star. A gamer in Seoul, Chicago, or Lagos navigated a pixelated Edo to learn the geometry of virtual duels. The figure became, simultaneously, simplification and invitation. Simplification, because no myth carries all its context with it. Invitation, because curiosity is a kind of loyalty that asks questions rather than bending the knee. Real students found real dojos. Real readers found real histories. Real smiths took real apprentices who hammered iron, not just keys. Back home, shrines and museums taught families to walk slowly. Cases held armor that flashed shell-like in gentle light. Labels offered dates, names provinces. Guides told stories in low voices, allowing pauses for images to finish constructing themselves in the visitor's mind. A lacquered cuirass that once carried a breath on cold mornings. A helmet crest shaped like horns worn by a man who wrote a poem in the saddle. A tanto blade whose hammer looked like clouds snagged on a ridge. Children asked whether these had seen battle. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes the answer was they saw a world where battle was expected, and that is almost the same thing. On the margins of cities, mountain dojos kept older atmospheres without cosplay. Students swept floors, folded hakama, bowed to the kamisa, where a calligraphy scroll taught perseverance without a lecture. Wooden swords slapped Minna's wrists when they reached too far. Teachers smiled, then didn't. After practice, a kettle sang. Tea poured into cups that did not aim to impress anyone but succeeded anyway. The talk avoided mysticism and lawsuits. When you bow, a sensei said, you set down the day, then you can pick up the blade without shaking. Memory became architecture. Castles rebuilt in concrete still placed their walls correctly to teach how siege and supply dance. In a quiet town, a single gate, original wood, outlived wars and earthquakes by outliving its immediate use. Bridges modelled after old forms reminded commuters that traffic once included horses and palanquins, and that those too required rules. The nation learned to sell its past without cheapening it. Festivals where armor and kimono moved together through streets that had learned neon. Parades where children carried cardboard swords that cut but boredom, and yet learned to respect the line. Then the earthquakes and tsunamis of politics and nature returned, as they always do. The question came back, what is the posture that endures? The best answers look suspiciously like the old ones, stripped of archaic costume. Do your work well. Keep your word, tend your tools. Stand when it's time to stand, kneel when it's time to kneel. Protect those beneath your roof and those who have no roof. Don't boast, share credit. Bow to the fact that you will die and try to make your life useful before that. If those lines sound like Bushido, it's because the good parts of Bushido never belonged to one class. They were always human decencies, sharpened by necessity and then polished by art. At night, on a Tokyo balcony, the modern skyline glints like a rack of new blades. Somewhere a student learns calculus for an exam that will change her family's life. Somewhere a chef hones a knife until salmon yields like smoke. Somewhere a novelist writes a samurai who never existed, but who tells a true story about fear and courage. Anyway, there in that web, the samurai survives, not as a costume party, but as a posture the country keeps in a mental closet, to be worn when dignity requires uniform. The warrior class died, the warrior habit did not. When the nation is tired, it still reaches for that habit. Tidy the room, square the shoulders, take the next step without asking whether the step after that will be easy. If you listen closely in the clatter of trains, you can hear hoofbeats under the rails. They do not cry for a return to war. They keep time for work and kindness and the refusal to run from hard days. Before we leave the long road, we should step off it into workshops and tatami rooms, the places where the samurai spirit expresses itself without speeches. These are small theatres, a forge's orange mouth, a calligrapher's white horizon, A tea hut's low door, here the country shapes its edge, not to wound, but to define. Begin at the forge. The air tastes like iron and pine charcoal. A bellows breathes with more patience than a human lung. On the anvil lies tamahagani, iron sand smelted in a clay furnace, that burns for days while men feed it, like a jealous god. The smith picks a billet, judges grain with eyes that learn to see at temperatures the rest of us can't endure. He folds metal like a priest folding cloth, inclusions worked into pattern, impurities coaxed into alignment. He welds a softer core to a harder jacket, so that the blade will flex without surrendering its bite. Clay slurry thick on the spine, thin on the edge, prepares the quench. Water hisses, the steel curves, sorry like the bow of a thought. When the mud flakes off, a ghost appears along the edge. Hammon, the temper line, cloudy or jagged, or like waves at night. It is the fossil of a decision, a snapshot of heat arguing with time. Polish reveals, never adds. Stones in gradations, from rough to whisper scheme, pull the surface from blur to mirror. A polisher's hands measure pressure on a scale between feather and oath. When he's done, the blade is not yet complete. The scabbard, saya, must fit like sleep. Carved to the individual, lacquered to please the durable eye, its mouth shaped so the sword does not bite its home. Fittings carry subplots, Suba guards where iron becomes seen, a pine on a cliff. Cranes over waves, a moon implied by negative space. Menuki ornaments tuck under the palm, secret companions for the right hand. The whole is an argument for intimacy between function and form. Once, such a blade decided succession and shaped borders. Now it decides whether a visitor remembers a museum forever. Once it asked to be fed blood. Now it drinks light. A modern smith knows both histories and works accordingly. He does not make weapons. He makes sentences for a language that refuses to die. Across town, a dojo unfolds like a diagram of respect. Floors gleam from generations of bare feet. At the kamisa hangs a scroll, mu, nothingness, or shin, heart, mind, curves thick as branch, thin as hair. Students bow to each other, to the room, to what they're about to practice. In kendo, bamboo swords, shinai clack like wooden bells. The armor men do, ko te, tare, transforms posture before the first strike. A good match looks like fast chess played with shouts. Ko te, wrist, men, head, do, belly, tsuki, throat. A technique teachers introduce last because its accuracy must be ethical as well as technical. Judges watch for kikentai ichi, spirit, sword, and body as one, no daylight between intent and execution. Points reward clarity as much as contact. Afterward, both fencers bow with sweat running off their chins, chests heaving like factory bellows after a long day. In Iaido, there is no opponent except the one who arrives with you. Kneel, breathe, draw, nukitsuke, cut, control, shake imaginary blood from the blade, return it, noto, without nicking the scabbard or your pride. The sequence is simple, the way a haiku is simple. If you misplace one syllable, the world notices. Practitioners measure decades in millimeters, the arc more exact, the left hand less greedy, the gaze less theatrical. When a class of Aiaidoka practices, the room sounds like cloth learning to speak. The beauty is stern. It is not for spectators, and yet it is generous to them. Kyudo occupies stillness, then punctures it. The bow is taller than its archer, asymmetrical like a coastline. Grip rotates, String draws past ear to the cheekbone's memory. The archer opens rather than pulls, as if allowing the bow to choose to bend. Release comes not as an act, but as a cessation. The arrow floats and then doesn't. On good days, it thuds center, and everyone pretends not to be pleased. On better days, it thuds off center, and the archer smiles without lying. The target is co-conspirator, not adversary. The lesson travels well elsewhere. A tea room waits. Its door is low to make all who enter bow. Inside, no furniture claims rank. The Tokugawa alcove hosts a single scroll, or a single flower, never both, and the room's power arises from what it refuses. The host moves as if time had agreed to be polite. Water simmers, not boils. Steam writes an essay, the window reads aloud. The bamboo whisk turns powder to foam. A bowl, humble or perfected by centuries, lifts and turns in hands practiced enough to seem absent. Guests admire not the price of the bowl, but the rightness of its placement against the tatame's grid and the season's mood. Outside wars are planned. Inside etiquette disarms everyone. The tea does not taste like triumph. It tastes like the absence of argument. Art bleeds between these rooms. Calligraphers practice large gestures to improve small ones. Sword teachers practice small ones to restrain large ones. Gardeners place stones where they contradict and complement. Sabi and Yugen, the beauty of age and the mystery beneath the scene, so that a path makes you decide where to put your feet. A no actor spends a decade learning how to turn his head. A shakuhachi player sends a note into the rafters that lands hours later as a better paragraph in a novelist's draft. In this ecology, the samurai's aesthetic survives, not as decoration, but as a discipline of subtraction. You remove everything unnecessary and discover there was more than you thought. On workbenches downtown, modern craftsmen aim that discipline at steel that never sees a scabbard. A chef's knife passes a paper test. A carpenter's chisel makes shavings like shrimp shells. A camera lens, ground in a plant with clean rooms, resolves a star that would have been an omen to a general, and is now a data point for an astronomer. Apprenticeships take years, masters say little, until the moment a sentence can steer a decade. Pride hides in aligned screws, and the way a hinge refuses to complain after the 10,000th open close. In global culture, the samurai keeps collecting new passports. Comic books draw him into galaxies, animation hurls him through portals, games let players mix sword with stealth and guilt. Sometimes it's silly, sometimes it's beautiful, often it's both. You can shrug at the inaccuracy, or enjoy the sincerity. The best works do the old work. They teach that courage without kindness is only noisy, and that loyalty must be chosen, not coerced. They teach that skill is a kind of love, that to master a technique is to respect the world enough to shape yourself for it. Museums and curators do a quieter job. They rescue a tsuba from rust, recognize the hand of a long-dead artisan in a wave pattern, trace a blade to a battle mentioned in a chronicle, whose copy is itself a treasure. They refuse to let the past be only a supply closet for the present's costume party. Catalogues become scripture for future smiths and scholars. Exhibitions become classrooms where a retiree and a child stand shoulder to shoulder, equally silent, because beauty has its own authority. Not every inheritance is easy. Some texts praise death in ways that today sound like a dare sent to teenagers. Some anecdotes bless cruelty as decisiveness. The modern reader must read with both eyes. One on the context that made certain choices logical, one on the moral progress that refuses to call everything logical good. The country negotiates with its past without breaking it. It keeps the blade and discards the swagger, keeps the bow and discards the blindfold, keeps the tea and discards the politics that would turn ceremony into coercion. At day's end, the workshops dim. The forge cools, its last sigh a memory in the rafters. Dojo windows turn black and reflect the students bowing out. The tea room closes like a sentence with a period soft as a felt tip. On a desk, a calligraphy scroll dries, the ink's sheen fading into permanence. The city hums, factories, offices, ports. Its rhythm steady as a hammer's beat, a heartbeat, a footstep on tatami. The samurai's world is gone. The samurai's worlds, plural in craft and posture, are very much alive. When people say spirit, they often mean this: the decision to do things properly when no one is watching, and the patience to keep doing them when someone is. Night over a keep. The moon catches on white plaster walls and slides down black tile roofs into the dry moat's quiet gravel. An owl repeats a syllable from a poem no one wrote down. Inside, paper walls breathe with the movement of people who learn to be quiet before they learn to speak. The samurai were never only steel and horses. They were paperwork, precedent, and posture. An edifice built not just from courage, but from clauses. Start with rules. The Tokugawa house orders for warriors. The Bukushihato read like a list of fences you can carry in your head. Don't build or repair castles without permission. Don't form alliances without approval. Don't travel without notice. Marry without consent. Change retainers. Like a gambler, changes dice. Study literature as well as war. Keep your men in order. Restrain extravagance. The purpose of such rules was not to cramp greatness, but to prevent greatness from turning into civil war. After a century and more of Sengoku, stability needed to be engineered as deliberately as a bridge. Those edicts were beneath national rules lay domain codes, hand laws, adjusted to local soil. Some domains prized thrift, others scholarship. Some demanded archery practice lines on certain days, others audited barns with a suspicion that bordered on art. The same bow that drew a bead on an enemy once now drew a bead on waste. Complacency and pride. Because power lives in detail, detail multiplied, who sits where, which gifts are appropriate, how to bow in a corridor only 3 feet wide when you meet a superior with a spear in hand and no time for you. But rules alone do not bind hearts. Stories do. The samurai's bookshelf carried cautionary tales and shining exemplars like paired swords. Most famous among them, the 47 Ronin. The outline is simple enough to repeat in a child's voice: a lord provoked, a sword drawn where none should be, a sentence carried out, a house dissolved into unemployment and shame. Then cold patience, 2 winters like stones in the mouth, until at last, one night of decisive justice, followed by the surrender none of them intended to escape. Read another way. The tale is a problem set. Which loyalty weighs more, the letter of the law or the unwritten contract with a dead lord? Is vengeance justice if everyone nods? Theatre made the answer obvious. Law made it complicated. Conscience made it heavy. That weight is why the story persists. We feel it even when we disagree. Ronin were both symptom and solvent in the samurai system. Masterless by misfortune or misconduct, they haunted margins and markets, some tutoring children in disciplined handwriting, others drinking stipends they no longer had, a few turning edge and cunning into crimes that made officials write harder. The existence of Ronin taught domains to care for their retainers and taught retainers to see the thinness of the ice under ceremony. Women, often written into the frame rather than the foreground, carried steel and strategy of their own. In some houses, daughters learned the naginata, the crescent-bladed polearm that keeps danger an arm and a half away. Household manuals included sections on defense, how to secure shutters, where to station servants, how to coordinate signals with neighbors should the gate splinter at an hour when men were not at home. Legends lift names into the air. Tomoe Gozen, riding through the Genpei war tales, like lightning engraved on lacquer, Nakano Tekeko, who led women of Aizu against imperial troops in the last convulsions of the Tokugawa era. Whether the stories grew in retelling matters less than the fact that they were told steel had more than one voice. Shadows threaded the system. Spies, scouts, saboteurs, men later wrapped into the universal word ninja. Strip away the fantasies of vanishing cloaks and smoke magic. What remains is a profession of intelligence and irregular tactics. Clans in Iga and Koga made a business of information. Night movement, infiltration, fire starting, where a siege would be expensive, map making, room attending, reading tracks, climbing where walls assumed you wouldn't, in epochs where a messenger could mean a month's advantage. A person who knew how to move unseen was worth as much as 100 spears that had nowhere to go. Castles themselves were textbooks disguised as stone. Look at a plan, outer moats, nested into inner ones, like parentheses. Bailey's offset, so that progress is a question that keeps asking itself. Masugata gates that force an entering column to kink and expose its ribs, white plaster that resists arrows and shrugs off sparks, arrow loops blossoming like dark flowers. Murder holes that reminded an attacker that gravity is a weapon. Siege was less a contest of bravery than of calories and carpentry. Engineers counted rice as ammunition. Sappers took soil temperature with their hands. Commanders watched the calendar as if it were a drum. In the courtroom, rectitude put on glasses. Disputes over borders, streams and harvest shares were the empire's daily wars. Magistrates balanced book and heart. A senior retainer learned to rule his own temper before ruling others. Mercy could be policy without becoming weakness. A debt restructured rather than enforced might keep a village alive long enough to pay twice. Yet severity had its theatre too. Punishments displayed in public were warnings to 1,000 who would rather not test the rope. Between these poles, governance achieved its unsung victories when conflict did not escalate at all. Codes for conduct, call them bushido, call them decency sharpened, entered the bloodstream through repeated acts. A guard salutes without being seen. A clerk returns a bribe with a joke, and a bow that leaves no wound. A young samurai takes blame to shelter his team, because he knows that fear produces more mistakes than hunger. Big wars have their poets. So does the bureaucracy, though its verses are uncollected. Not every legend flatters. The ritual of seppuku, self-disembowelment, spoke to a terrifying clarity. I own my responsibility so completely that I make my body the site of its settlement. In practice, it often became stylized. Witnesses, a short blade, a second who ended suffering swiftly. In myth, it became something it never should be, a romance with death. Modern readers must look at it with both ruthlessness and compassion. Ruthlessness to refuse glamour, compassion to understand how a warrior surrounded by the geometry of duty could choose a line that pointed only inward. If the samurai bequeathed one lesson for how not to live, it is to avoid making death eloquent. Religion braided through all of this without a single knot. Shinto shrine forests, seasonal offerings, the sense that mountains have moods, gave local color and gentle obligations to place. Buddhism, from stately Tendai halls to whispering Zen hermitages, offered a grammar for impermanence and an ethics attention. Neo-Confucianism supplied the calculus of hierarchy and reciprocity, ruler-subject, father-son, friend-friend, all duties run in both things if you want the machine to purr. The samurai lived at the intersection, burning incense one day, reciting Analects the next, sitting on a cushion, staring at a wall the third, then standing to fix a food distribution schedule, as if famine were a koan. Weapons shifted around those ethics like furniture rearranged for new guests. The yumi, longbow, kept its dignity in ritual and sport. The yori spear wrote the prose of formation. The naginata guarded thresholds and taught balance. The tanagashima wrote thunder in lines. The tachi wore an edge down. Ceded status to the katana, edge up, as riding and fighting styles changed. The wakizashi stayed close for rooms where horses were rumor. Together they were not an arsenal, so much as a vocabulary. A good commander knew which word to choose and when to shut up.
Outside the heartland, other rhythms taught humility. The Ainu in the north, with their bare ceremonies and traded blades and stubborn independence, reminded officials that empire draws borders around people who do not recognize them. In the south, the Ryukyu kingdom spun trade into culture while paying dances of tribute that only sometimes conceded substance. The samurai story frays at its edges into other stories with their own heroes and hurts. Good history allows that fray to show.
When the Meiji tide came, one law knocked like a fist on a dojo door. The Heito-rei Edict of 1876, banning the wearing of swords in public by most civilians. The gesture had layers: public order, symbolic break, practical safety. But the shock was singular. Hands that had learned the weight of steel found their sides empty. Some sheathed their pride inside new roles. Some reached for revolt. Some folded blades into family altars, where incense gathered on steel like soft dust. The state won. The sword retreated from street to mind, from badge to relic, from daily tool to refined art. Legends did not retire. They translated. Playhouses kept the Ronin alive. Storytellers took fees for tears. Woodblock prints framed old fury in vermilion and indigo. New schools taught old moves with shinai and rules. In the shadows a quieter heroism grew. A magistrate who refused graft. A quartermaster who got rice through a flood. A widow who balanced books and dignity in the same ledger. If you walk a castle town today, Himeji's white heron walls, Matsumoto's black crow crouch, Hikone's neat geometry, you feel both the firmness of the old order and its hollowness, like bones cleaned by time and placed back in their proper relationship. In a museum case, a pair of swords sleeps beneath glass, while a guard glances up when a visitor leans too close, then relaxes when the visitor bows unasked. Much of what held the class together survives in habits that no longer need armor: knees folded properly, shoes pointed the same way, a pause before speaking that rescues words from waste. Before we close the box of daily life, lift its lid in the morning. The samurai wakes early, not from zeal, but from habit. Tatami, rustle. A wooden pillow has left its small advice on the neck. In the corner of the room, sword stand, armor chest, writing desk, and family shrine share space like four elements: edge, shell, word, and prayer. Outside, a vendor calls tofu. A rooster considers professionalism. The well rope creaks in a voice that changes with humidity. Clothes first. A loincloth and underrobe. A kimono layered with seasonal scents, unlined in summer, padded when frost draws maps on the wash basin. A hakama tied with familiarity that does not require looking down. On formal days, a short jacket, the harai with the family crest, like a stamp on the air. Hair is chonmaij, the top knot curled and oiled into a shape that declares both class and compliance. Its shaving line another border policed by barbers who know secrets. Swords slide into the belt. Last, daisho, two arguments you hope not to make. Breakfast is simple because day lengths are not. Rice, if stores are healthy. Barley if they are not. Miso soup, that recites its own recipe, the sea whispering from kelp. And dried fish, pickles for salt. Perhaps a grilled small thing, with bones that remind you of structure. Tea is for clarity, not conversation. Children eat, too, from bowls that are metaphors. Small hands learn proportion by lifting with 2 fingers and a thumb. Work divides by rank and role. A senior retainer walks to the magistrate's office, over clean streets gravelled, not by accident, but by ordinance. He signs in with a brush that remembers last week's ink. Petitions await. A boundary dispute between farmers. One swears a ditch wandered, the other swears a neighbour did. A merchant wants permission to move his shop 3 doors down. A carpenter asks exemption from corvée labour to finish repairing a bridge. No one wants collapsing in the rains. The retainer listens more than he speaks. He knows power breaks when it hurries. A mid-level samurai oversees rice deliveries at the domain's warehouse. Bales arrive like seated monks. He inspects the cords, the weave, the weight, fingers disappearing into grain like a diviner sticks into water. Ink marks tally units into obligations, obligations into stipends. He counts rats as enemies of the state and cats as contractors. He knows the smell that means damp and the tone that means rot. He is happiest when bored, because boredom means nothing has gone wrong yet. A younger samurai escorts a mail packet along the post road, eyes on faces, faces on his swords. He is more polite than his father would have been, and more observant than his grandfather had to be. At the relay, he drinks water, checks the seal, glances at the sky, and thinks about poetry because everyone thinks about poetry even when pretending not to. He composes a tanka in his head and forgets the 3rd line by the time he dismounts. The loss bothers him more than the dust. Women run the engine, no edict admits. A lady of the house rehearses accounts with the fluency of a scribe, instructs servants with economy, inspects the pantry as if it were a barracks. She practices naginata with a friend in the afternoon, laughter stationed at the door, like a guard who knows when to look away. She could run the domain for a month, if she had to. She hopes she never has to. A daughter copies sutras, then reads a love story with lips that move. Food returns. As midday apology, leftovers, judiciously improved. The afternoon leans toward instruction. Dojo time, wooden swords thud against bamboo, then stop for a lecture on etiquette that is actually about balance. The master speaks of mai, interval, as if it were a social virtue. Students nod, half understanding. Later in life they will understand more, regret that the master is dead, and teach the same lesson with different jokes. Evening brings errands, a trip to a tea shop where leaves are weighed on a scale that pretends to be impartial, and usually is a stop at a temple to deliver coins and news, a pause at a friend's house to admire a new ink painting that looks like 3 rocks and a tree, and is actually about time. A small daughter insists on seeing a kabuki actor passing to the theatre. Her father lifts her up, and she counts the hairpins on the attendant's head with a seriousness that makes them both kinder when they set her down. Money is a quiet tyrant. The stipend arrives in rice, converted to coin at rates that wobble like a drunk on a boat. A samurai who imagines himself above account books learns to eat humility. Debts become inheritance, as surely as swords. Merchants, nominally low in rank, practice a high art, saying no in ways that make you thank them. Some retainers take second jobs in schooling or literature, inventing the modern concept of respectability as they go. A lucky few write a book that later centuries quote wrong, and thus preserve perfectly. The seasons edit the script. In cherry time, Men go outside to remember fleetingness. In plum time, they remember endurance. In maple time, they remember that endings can be operatic. In snow, they listen harder, because quiet is a teacher. Festivals reorder streets. Portable shrines sway like ships carried by men who shout until sweat tastes sweet. Gion, Tenjin, Kanda, the names are bells. Children chase masks. Old people clap at exactly the right moment without having to look at the others to coordinate. A samurai on leave carries the pole for a block, finds it heavier than his rank, laughs and bows out to let stronger backs take over. Illness visits without appointment. A physician presses a wrist, reads pulses that speak in paragraph, prescribes herbs and advice about the weather inside. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the family writes a letter with an inkstone that refuses to dry tears. Death rituals are as much for the living. White cloth, incense like a stairway, names written that will be whispered by grandchildren who never saw the hand that held the brush. At night, shutters slide. Oil lamps teach walls to glow. A man mends a sandal strap. Proof that patience can be practical. Another copies a passage from a Chinese classic into a small book he will someday give his son with the one sentence that mattered underlined twice. A girl practices a tea whisk movement until foam knows its place. A boy sneaks a look at his father's sword and feels a gravity he doesn't yet have muscles for. The house sleeps in layers, like armor stacked by function, grandparents first, children second, parents last. Dreams go their rounds, carrying messages no one will remember properly but everyone will obey. Step forward a few decades. The Hater-Ray Edict has closed the street to blades, and the mourning now includes putting on a jacket that sits oddly on shoulders made for armor. The office replaces the barracks for many. A train timetable replaces the drum. The rice stipend becomes a government bond whose interest checks arrive like a friend who's on time but brings too little food. Some households sell a lacquered chest to pay school fees for a son who will become a teacher who will save a village. Others sell a blade to a foreigner and do not speak for an hour afterward. Pride learns new disguises. New arts creep in beside old ones. A photograph of the family stands beside the household altar. The grandfather in kamishimo starched into geometry, the father in a western suit, the son barefoot because shoes are for school. The daughter reads a novel in a script the grandfather would find childish and the father finds refreshing. Dinner includes bread on Tuesdays because the mother has friends near the docks and is clever. The family talks about a strike at a mill and whether it is proper to sympathize. The grandfather pours tea and changes the subject by asking whether anyone saw the moon. Compare across oceans for a moment, because sleep likes bridges. A European knight in chain and surcoat rides into this chapter and recognizes cousins, a horseman's pride, a code congested with God and obligation, a sword that defines more than it kills, a castle that is both home and threat. He also sees difference, a bureaucracy that fused to the class like tendon, an aesthetics that made restraint the mirror of strength, a legalism that polished loyalty into a working part rather than a stage speech. He bows awkwardly because his manners don't fit the room, and leaves having learned the word ma, interval, and wishing he had known it during his own sieges. Return to the house. A storm practices on the roof, then decides it has other appointments. The family sleeps. In a corner, the sword remains wrapped in its bag, a shape recognized by hands that will belong to people not yet born. The bag holds air, not violence. It is a sack of weather, a memory of the time when a class was a country's spine, and then learned to become a kind of nerve instead. Invisible, indispensable, pulsing with quiet advice. Stand straighter, speak less, cut cleaner in your work, and be kind where the world is sharp. Daily life is soft power. It hums. It does not demand applause. It trains the hand to pour tea without spilling, and the mind to decide without bulletin. It is how a warrior class became a citizenry without losing its breath. If you listen in the lane outside, you can almost hear tomorrow walking toward the door, polite, punctual, bearing both challenges and good news. Begin at the margins, where the main story forgets to look. History often walks the broad avenue with banners. Truth keeps side streets that smell of kelp, peat, lacquer, and smoke from unfamiliar hearths. The samurai stood at the empire's center for centuries, but their lives were braided with people who wore no crests, people whose crests meant something else, and people whose seas and forests resisted every census. North, winter rain-scribes the land each year. Snow making philosophy of silence. The Ainu live there with words that treat bears as relatives and rivers as teachers. Traders from the south arrive with rice, iron, and assumptions. Magistrates count households like shells and find their math, undone by mobility and pride. Samurai sent to guard, govern, or extract learn that boundaries drawn in ink do not hold against salmon runs and ancestral roots. Sometimes accommodation blooms, marriages shared hunts, barter made ritual, sometimes arrogance curdles, bringing violence and policy that calls itself improvement while breaking what it touches. The frontier teaches a hard lesson the center always needs. Authority is a local language. Speak it wrong, and you make enemies out of weather. Way south, subtropical winds comb the Ryukyu Islands into fronds and surf. A small kingdom writes its diplomacy as dance, tribute to China, bows to Satsuma, trade with anyone whose hull can find the coral gap. Courts in Kyoto and Edo call this ambiguity perfidy. Islanders call it survival. Samurai who come to supervise and tax discover a people fluent in courtesy and sales. Music overturns hierarchy in these ports. A merchant with the right contacts can help a general, and a shipwright holds a lord's fate in his thumb scar. The empire absorbs Ryukyu eventually titles, offices, uniforms, but its songs refuse to be fileable, in taverns and on decks. The shamisen laughs at paperwork. In Kyushu's hill-shadowed valleys, another edge burned for a century, faith imported and faith enforced. The first missionaries stepped ashore with crucifixes and consonants that bent differently in the mouth. Lords flirted with conversion as policy and conscience. A few domains folded churches into their estate plans. Others banned the new rites with edicts and ropes. Samurai looked at the cross and saw either treason to their rituals or a mirror for their own language of sacrifice. The Shimabara uprising fused taxes, hunger, and Christian banners into fire. The samurai, defending order against their own tenants, learned how faith can mobilize as fiercely as famine. After suppression came crucifixes buried in gardens and prayers whispered to statues filed as canon. Memory learned mass. Outsiders looked inward too. Women whose names went unrecorded trained with the naginata because castles host children, elders and courage, not just men. Household codes, those practical scriptures taught how to bar shutters, store water and buy time until allies arrived. The romantic tales pick a few names for pedestals. Tomoe, Hangaku, Teiko, but the daily heroics were washing bandages, encoding rumors, balancing ledgers when a husband's bravado outpaced income, and teaching sons to bow without growing brittle. The way of the house was not decorative to the way of the sword, it was its hinge. Craftsmen lived just off the stage, shaping the props that made history possible. A swordsmith knew the scent that meant the iron was saying yes. A lacquerer layered patience into vessels that did not mind weather. A bowyer tuned glue and bamboo with the attention a general gives to a map. Armourers stitched silence into lacing so plates would not betray footsteps on stone. Their signatures, when permitted at all, were small, a file mark hidden under the collar, a curl in a wave pattern no one else would think to carve. Samurai spoke of honour, artisans built it in materials, peasants, the necessary majority, kept the calendar. They paid stipends with their backs, and the weather's moods. In bad years, they organised icky leagues, the village deciding to resist, negotiate or flee together. Some domains listened, some beat, some learned to borrow humility when the fields threatened to revolt more effectively than any army. Samurai born to command were made literate in seasons by the people who watched frogs and knew what they meant. A government that forgot this found its granaries whispering warnings too late. Monks, meanwhile, threaded between court, castle, and hamlet. Buddhists debated doctrine inside cedar. Shinto priests fed shrines with offerings that smelled like home. Confucian scholars lectured in corridors that taught a different posture for the same bow. Warrior monks kept toll roads honest or corrupt, depending on your perspective and their accounts. Temples could be states, and some had armies, banners, and grudges. Nobunaga burned what he could not bargain with. Later rulers co-opted what they could not burn. And the shadows, that profession the world loves to over-romanticize, did the quiet work of imbalance. Call them ninja if you want. But shave the word down to what facts will bear. Families who sold expertise in moving, unseen, setting fires where siege would cost too much. Climbing walls designed to repel ladders, reading absence the way others read presence. They thrived when the world was too proud to plan for them. In Edo's peace, some ran security for wealthy townsmen. Others taught rope, disguise or night movement to officials who read too many reports to believe in magic. There were strangers who came not with swords but with syllables and songs. The Dutch lens at Dejima reconfigured sight. Rangaku physicians drew muscles and taught humility to doctors whose diagnostics were a thumb on a wrist and a poet's empathy. Later, American steamships called on a country that thought its tides were domesticated. The courtyards filled with blue cloth and brass buttons, translators and treats. Some samurai learned to drill to foreign drums without surrendering their dignity. Others flexed old formulas that broke under new chemistry. The result, revolts, reforms, resignations, was less betrayal of the class than its transmutation. A caste designed for sudden death had to learn daily life in a hurry. Law framed these meetings. Byukushohato pinned daimyo to pattern. Domain codes managed what the shogunate could not see. Village codes resolved quarrels before soldiers had to. The system's genius was distributing responsibility downward while keeping awe pointed up. Its failure was sometimes the same when fear replaced respect. Villages learned to whisper. Then came the Meiji shears, cutting through knots with exciting and terrifying efficiency. Swords went indoors, titles rearranged, borders redrawn. Some edges of the map finally received labels they had not asked for. All of which is to say, the samurai were a chord, not a note. Their music resonated because other instruments, craft, faith, village, frontier, sea, were playing. Stand at any edge and listen. You'll hear the center better than the center hears itself. The true test of a class's greatness is how it treats those who cannot belong to it. On that score, the record is mixed and human. The sword defended, the sword extracted, the sword posed for portrait. The sword became a plowshare in spirit when not in fact. Tonight, as sleep lowers its eyelids, picture a dim road where the official patrol has already passed. A peddler balances baskets. A monk taps his staff. A woman in travel hat counts steps to keep fear small. On a ridge, a scout watches without being seen. In a farmhouse, an old man sharpens a sickle as if it were a memory. The map is wider than any tale, and every margin writes a line the chronicles will miss. The class at the center stands because the edges hold. One last time, step onto the bridge between heaven and sea. The spear drops, islands rise, shining with salt and possibility. In the distance, centuries away, horsehair crests bob on ridgelines, closer still a lifetime off. Paper doors slide in Edo, nearer this moment. City glass holds a reflection of a blade, as thin as a thought. We have walked a long road together, and the sand still remembers our footprints. Let's walk it once more, slowly, so sleep can catch up. Begin with water. Jomon, fires banked against wind, shell mounds like calendars. Yayoi fields mirror sky, rice rewrites time into rose, chiefs whisper genealogy, iron whispers different promises. Yamato gathers uji like a fisher draws in a net. Court takes on color, Chinese ink, Buddhist gold, while Shogun estates loosen the central hand. Heian perfumes the air, teaches sleeves how to speak, and accidentally invents distance by writing too much about closeness. Out beyond the screens, men in lamellar armor help harvests speak for themselves with arrows. Minamoto and Taya rehearse the first national argument in proper nouns. Uji's bridge, Ichi no Tani's slope, Yashima's fan, Dan no Ura's tide, each a stanza, together a chant. A child emperor sinks with a regalia's glint, and the sea closes like a book. Kamakura reads power differently, Shugo, Jito, oaths that fit in the mouth and bind the spine. Zen finds a home in rooms without furniture, and the bow remains the sentence opener. The sword begins to write in clauses. Mongol ships shoulder the horizon, drums and bombs introduce a new grammar. Seawalls grow from worry into stone. Raids at night, summer winds, a typhoon that earns a name build confidence and debt together. Huyo caretakers steady a nation, and then fall to an emperor who wants more than radiance. Godaigo's restoration blazes like a struck match. Takoji blows. 2 courts light 2 altars. Warlords learn that legitimacy is a currency you can counterfeit if you print enough victories. The Ashikaga stage, a century where art becomes policy. No slowness cuts deeper than speed. Kinkaku floats like a rumor the pond believes. Tea compresses diplomacy into 3 sips and a silence. Then on-in war burns the script and leaves scenery. Provinces crystallize around daimyo, who learn both calculus and cruelty. Castles sprout on ridges. Rice becomes lines in a book that define a man's reach. Formations replace boasts. The era earns the name Sengoku by refusing to pretend. From the south, fire in tubes. Portugal by accident. Guns by intention. Nobunaga builds fences, and the future at Nagashino hangs tapestries of markets and heads, and makes Osaka think in cubes of stone before Hideyoshi makes it think bigger. Hideyoshi measures land by appetite, collects swords into stories, elevates tea to an ethics, and sends armies overseas because ambition doesn't sleep. They return spent. Ieyasu counts fog and friends at Sekigahara, then builds a government that teaches ambition to walk in circles, Senkin Kotai's metronome, laws that hold castles still, marriages that bind yesterday to tomorrow. Edo hums. Merchants lend, artists cut blocks into worlds. Kabuki shows everyone how to look at themselves without blushing. Samurai write codes that name virtues as if they were rivers you can own. Magistrates learn to pronounce mercy and discipline without swallowing either. Swords go out less. Brushes go out more. Zen lends patience. Confucius lends grammar. Shinto keeps the seasons honest. Children memorize kana and ancestors. Women keep domains from fraying by knowing who owes what to whom and when to press, and when to pour tea. Ships from far maps nose into bays, letters wear uniforms. The old system cannot metabolize new metal without choking. Sono Yoi turns from slogan into contradiction, then into war. Edo opens its gates the way a stubborn man sighs. The Boshin campaign writes the obituary of a shogunate with cannon and a few delicate negotiations. Hokkaido hosts a final act no one asks for because the script is already decided. The emperor returns as institution and intention. Domains become prefectures, stipends become bonds, swords become paperwork or art. The samurai dissolve and do not vanish. They pass through the nation like salt through soup, irreplaceable once dissolved. Some fail the transition and write their end in hills. Most learn new uniforms and keep old habits, punctuality as love, integrity as weapon, neatness as ambition. Factories replace forges, and yet the forges still glow now for knives that make chefs into surgeons, for chisels that make houses breathe, for camera lenses that let galaxies confess. Dojos replace barracks. Children shout men and coating and discover that losing with dignity is faster training than victory by accident. War misreads the code once, carving death into slogan, and the country pays in ash. Then it decides to do a harder thing. Crafts bloom. Literature holds the mirror a little longer each decade. Film teaches entire planets to feel a gust of wind on a Ronin's sleeve, as if it were their own weather. Tourists climb castle stairs that now hold history instead of archers. Museums lull blades into sleep that glows. Tea survives everything and keeps its standards higher than fashion. Low doorway, quiet hands, a bowl that refuses to flatter the drinker. On the edges, Ainu ceremonies still teach reciprocity. Ryukyu melodies still sail. Hidden Christians still keep icons disguised as bodhisattvas in glass cases where shame becomes tenderness. Women's stories leak out of walls into pages. Ninja stop being magic and start being logistics again. Peasants become citizens and keep the weather in the conversation. Artisans sign their work with excellence. And you've walked all of this at the pace of breath. You've watched iron bend into grace, and grace bend into law, and law bend into mercy. You've seen the bow become a meditation, and the sword become a lesson plan. You've watched power learn to sit down, and talent learn to stand up. If there is a code left to keep, it is not a list of commands, but a posture. Do the hard thing without drama. Keep your word and your tools in good order. Treat beauty as a duty and strength as a loan. Move quietly enough to hear other people's fears before they shout. Accept that you will die. Refuse to let that make you smaller while you live. Set your bundle down. The road is finished for tonight. In a quiet room that could be Kamakura, Kyoto, Edo, or Tokyo, depending on the century you choose, a sword lies wrapped, a bow leans in a corner, a tea bowl waits, and a ledger is closed with an ink line that looks like a horizon. Outside, rain makes the same sound on tile it has always made. Inside, breath becomes tide. Close your eyes. Imagine horse hoof prints filling with water and reflecting stars. Imagine a castle gate that opens onto morning markets instead of armies. Imagine a dojo where two children bow and mean it. Imagine a forge going dark with satisfaction instead of lack. The entire history of the samurai is a long, careful exhale after 1,000 quick inhalations. Let that breath carry you down. Steel has finished speaking. Sleep answers in a language older than war.